Furedi TV. The world is thinking.
Okay, good morning everyone. There's still people coming through registration and into the back, so just ignore the disturbance, but it's important to start on time so that we can keep to schedule, because as you know, I think there's about 8 slots for debate today. So for the enthusiastic, you can be debating for pretty much 12 hours non-stop. Anyway, my name's Tony Gilland. I'm the Science and Society Director at the Institute of Ideas, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to Battle of Ideas 2008. This is the 4th annual festival organised by the Institute of Ideas in partnership with the Royal College of Art and many other organisations. It's become a forum that's taken increasingly very seriously as an important platform for discussing the future direction of society. And I'm very pleased to say for the 4th consecutive year we have record ticket sales. So apologies if it gets a bit crowded later on, but we're very pleased to be bucking current economic trends. On that note, if any of you know any wealthy benefactors who take ideas and debate see it as an important thing, please let me know. We are seriously all ears. Okay, before I introduce our panel of speakers, who are not really here to speak as such and start a debate, but more to address you and welcome you to the festival and tell you why they think it's important and why their organisation is supporting the Battle of Ideas, I just want to say a thank you to a few organisations and people. First of all, thank you to all of our headline sponsors and partners, the Royal College of Art, the Times, BT, the ESRC and SAB Miller. There are also numerous other organisations sponsoring and partnering with us which are in the programme. And without them, it simply would not be possible to hold this event. So it really is superb that so many of them have supported us consistently for these last 4 years, or have come on more recently to join in with the battle. There's also a huge number of individuals who make this event happen. Particularly, there's a Battle of Ideas committee of about 50 individuals who programme and promote all of the event. And it's done with a huge amount of voluntary support and people's free time. So I'd like to thank them. Okay, without further ado, I would first like to ask to address you Sir Christopher Frayling, who's the Rector of the Royal College of Art and the Chair of the Arts Council. And as we've been working with the Royal College of Art for the last 4 years, and that's been a marvellous relationship, thank you very much for that, Chris. If you've heard any of his jokes before, please try not to laugh before he's reached the punchline.
Oh, yeah, that's me. Yeah, okay, very good. Well, welcome everyone to the Royal College of Art, its galleries, seminar rooms, lecture theatre, and so on for this year's Battle of Ideas. Way back, David Hockney was a graduate of this college in the early 60s, and recently he gave a talk about how best to teach art. And he said, the key thing when you're teaching art is that your teacher should have a very strong point of view. You may disagree with it, you may get angry with it, you may fight it, but the cardinal sin is to say yes to everything. So the system goes in like sponge when you press it. And that the great relationship in teaching art is someone who has a very strong point of view and a very strong practice themselves, and out of that, the student finds their own voice. And I believe that profoundly, and I think it's also the philosophy of the Battle of Ideas. Can be combustible, but good creative things can come out of it. Since the very first battle 4 years ago, as we've heard, and it's definitely true, the event has gone from strength to strength. And it leads one to hope, although not much else does, I have to say, that thinking as a publicly performed activity has become fashionable again, outside the groves of academe. In some ways, the Battle of Ideas has a similar sphere of interest as the BBC, to inform, to educate, and to entertain, hopefully without the insults. I'll tell you now, there'll be no phoning of Andrew Sachs actually during the seminar. And someone came up to me yesterday and said they actually found Andrew Sachs's stereotypical performance as a Spanish waiter a great deal more offensive than anything that's happened in the last week. Discuss. What will be here, though, is much food for thought, a lot of it, and a lot of it very close to the concerns which are interrogated by this college every day. Debates about design and urban planning, futuristic transportation, innovation, collaborative technical interactions, the rights and wrongs of intellectual property, that's a big issue with us, art in the digital age, art and identity. And it's always unfortunate that the battle of ideas takes place when we're changing round exhibitions in the galleries. So the galleries have this rather cavernous, empty aspect. But we've put one on specially for you this year. It's an exhibition from our Design Interactions department, which is a department that criticises design and criticises technology through the medium of design, particularly biomedical technology. They're quite complicated installations, 6 design interactions projects, but the students, the postgraduate students, will be standing by their bunks, at least we've asked them to. They'll be standing by their bunks. So if you want to have a look closely at the exhibition, do ask the students to take you through their installations, because they're a kind of visualisation of debate. The range of themes over the next couple of days: arts and culture, economics, education, health and well-being, international relations, law, media, politics, etc., as you'd expect. And I think the battle of ideas is rapidly becoming a foil to the low intellectual temperature that pervades public life. Last Wednesday, on a freezing cold day, next door at the Albert Hall, literally hundreds of people queued up from 11 in the morning for the National TV Awards in the hope of catching a glimpse of a C-list celebrity. And it was quite extraordinary to see people standing there for 12 hours in the freezing cold in the hope of just catching a glimpse of someone as they get out of a car. Well, today, on this side of the street, I'm delighted to say we've got hundreds of people lining up, as you say, record bookings, for the Battle of Ideas, which I hope is a rather more constructive way of spending one's time. It would be wonderful if just some of the passion, the curiosity, and the joy in partaking in public intellectual debate were to feed into everyday life. Our neighbour in the Science Museum, Chris Rapley, who's the director, said, "It's a rare opportunity to debate firsthand with those involved in the great issues of our time." And we're absolutely delighted to be involved with it for the 4th year running. Final point, I know a lot of work's gone into this over the last year, and I gather it started the very day after, actually you started on the first day of the battle, trying to find a new sponsor, but it started the day after the last battle was brought to a close, with events running throughout the year, leading to this weekend. Congratulations to Claire and the rest of her terrific team at the Institute of Ideas for providing the opportunity to engage with the issues that affect all of us. Welcome to the 2008 Battle of Ideas. Let battle commence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Okay, next to speak, please, is John Dovey, who's the President of UK Corporates at BT Global Services. John, please.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning, everyone, and welcome from a BT corporate perspective. I guess I wanted to make a couple of observations from the business world and also a very personal observation about why I think the Battle of Ideas is a fantastic ongoing way of introducing and driving open and innovative debate. I work in an organisation that provides services to corporate customers in over 160 countries globally. We have a global and very diverse workforce and customers that we need to work with. And I think the key to success going forwards for any business is how we collaborate and communicate and look for new innovative ways of working with our customers, our partners and suppliers in this very global and diverse world. And the Battle of Ideas philosophy about encouraging that open and innovative debate and looking for long-term solutions rather than short-term fixes, I think is going to be core for businesses to succeed going forwards. Allied to that, and really building on what Christopher said, I think there's also an ongoing battle in business between style and substance. Nobody who's worked in the corporate world will fail to recognise the need to be able to eloquently deliver a 2-minute soundbite. But I think increasingly and importantly, there's much more challenge going on about what's the substance that backs up the style. And I think Battle of Ideas is a great place to hone your ability to test the substance of your ideas in an open and constructive fashion. And I guess my final point is a personal one. My daughter Bethan, who's 16, is here with me today. Bethan has already taken an active interest in being involved in debating. She took it upon herself to get elected last year as a Youth Parliament member in the West Midlands and has already spoken in a debate in the House of Lords, so I'm clearly not worthy to speak to my daughter and debate with her. And I noticed in the agenda today there are a number of debates concerning professional parenting, so I am hoping during one of those segments to get some ideas to take back for my wife and I to figure out how we're going to persuade Bethan to clean a room sometime in the next decade. So enjoy the weekend, enjoy the battles. I look forward to lively debates in the sessions I'm involved with. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, John. I think it is worth saying that hard-fought debate is controversial, it is edgy, it's not safe. And in danger of being labelled as turning this into a sponsor pitch, this welcome address, I do think it's worth noting that often corporates are actually not that keen to have their brands exposed to things that are genuinely edgy as opposed to flippant and funny. And I think it is a real credit to both BT and also SAB Miller and other organisations that they're prepared to back what is a genuinely open debate where free speech is allowed and nothing that is said is unacceptable in the sense that it can be said. So I would really like to thank them for that and say that there should be more of you. So if you're in the audience, come and talk to me. However, moving on to our third panellist, Sujata Sen is the Director of the British Council in East India. And I'm really pleased to welcome Sujata, flown in from Kolkata, where their office is based, because she's made it possible through her enthusiasm and commitment to intellectual life to bring a large number of Indian intellectuals to the battle this year. And also working with us on our schools debating competition, which has been a success in the UK. And again, with Sujata's superb enthusiasm and motivation, is allowing us to take that to India in January. So welcome, Sujata.
Thank you, Tony. Ladies and gentlemen, we feel privileged to be able to partner the Battle of Ideas. The Institute of Ideas' approach to real debate, rejecting anodyne consensus, taking ideas seriously, allowing free speech, has an instant appeal and synergy with British Council's work in the area of intercultural dialogue. Intercultural dialogue is a much bandied term, but our message is simple. Through the wide range of programs that we support in the area of arts, education, governance, and science, we are just acknowledging that the obvious, that the world in which we live is a world of differences, differences within cultures as well as differences between cultures, and that it's imperative and necessary to develop mutual trust and understanding between people with diverse opinions, viewpoints, and values. And we can only do this with a commitment to listen with respect and communicate with directness. Our partnership with Institute of Ideas extends to debating matters, as Tony just mentioned, which is now a very excellent India strand, a program for school students for confronting real-world issues. And this is shaping up well. 250 schools have already registered in India, and the Facebook section of the Debating Matters India website has hundreds of people from India and UK talking to each other and dialoguing with each other. What more could we have hoped? The Battle of Ideas is some fine Indian speakers and delegates, especially in the battle on capitalism, culture, reading, progress, and cricket. The tradition of debate in India predates modern notions of the nation state and democracy, rooted in its ancient literature that stressed open dialogue. Debate is intrinsic to the life of the ordinary Indian. The whole of the country stops when the national team plays cricket, and also during a parliamentary debate, as we saw in the recent trust vote motion. The right to probe ideas, disagree with perspectives, and dispute the ways and means of social justice are factors critical for the success of the world's largest democracy. I'm sure the Indian speakers will give you a flavor of this, and I'm personally looking forward to the 2 days of a stimulating environment of debate, with immense gratitude to Claire Fox and her excellent dynamic team. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata. And now please Astrid Wissenberg, who's the Director of Communications and Information at the Economic and Social Research Council, without whose funding of social research in this country, we wouldn't be able to have an informed debate. So, Astrid.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is that one working? Yep. Okay. I'd like to add my welcome on behalf of the Economic and Social Research Council to this event. The remit of the ESRC, as Tony referred to, is to fund the best social science research in the UK. We fund research which challenges and pushes the boundaries of accepted practice and knowledge. And that's exactly why the Battle of Ideas is such a natural partner to us and why we're delighted to be associated with it. Now, last night I was thinking of an inspiring and rousing introduction for this morning, and I'd had rather a hard week. And I was struggling, battling indeed, as my husband taught me, to find a source of original inspiration that could actually live up to the challenge of this weekend. Now, I could say all the things about the importance of public debates and free speech, being critical to address the key issues facing our global society, but some of my other speakers have already done that. I could tell you that that's exactly why in ESRC we believe it's so important to fund events like this and to support public debate. The battles do provide a natural platform for social scientists to actually engage in vigorous dialogues, to have their ideas challenged, and in turn to challenge other people's ideas. That is really how knowledge and understanding is created and changed. I could also expand on how pleased we actually are to be the school's champion and to provide support for up to 150 young people to attend the event. Or I could highlight how, as a major funder of postgraduate students in the social sciences, we sponsored the Associated Essay Competition for PhD students, writing essays on topics like America and the family. I could even mention the stand we have in the marketplace. You can see that I was getting quite desperate to fill my 3 minutes, and it all sounded a bit too obvious. Now, last year when I was standing here, I actually did have quite a good idea the evening before. I used my welcome to dissect and analyse the word debate from both an English language and a Dutch language perspective. And I use that to actually explain some of the different cultural connotations about debate, battle, etc. It might sound boring now, but actually it worked quite well at the time. Now, continuing to exploit the fact that I'm Dutch, that I happen to know 2 languages reasonably well and 2 cultures maybe less well, that sounded a little bit too gimmicky as well. So I thought, well, last up, if you're really stuck for inspiration for an intro, you go and have a look at the programme. Now, I turned to the programme and there was so much there. Family, food, communities, America, education, emerging economies, credit crunch, world music, urban design, all of those things. And it was at that point I actually decided I'd wasted enough time in trying to find some inspiration, because what I really needed, sitting alone in my living room, and what I was missing was actually the discussion, the debate, the interaction. I actually needed to be here at this event with you to debate these issues. So I've made one promise to myself. Just in case I end up next year again in this place, not making any promises yet, but just in case, and I again have to think of a welcome, I'm actually going to write my welcome this year during the event, because I'm convinced that there'll be more than enough inspiration in all of the contributions that you will all be making to the battle to really help me to write a good, invigorating speech for next year. So I'm looking forward to joining you all for this weekend of dialogue, debate, and celebrating free speech and the exchange of ideas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all 4 of you. Just a final few brief words before we depart for the first debates. Just like to say, I think, based on the evidence of the last 3 years, you can expect to be provoked and stimulated at the weekend, even made angry. In fact, I would say, if none of the debates this weekend raise your pulse rate, please go and see your doctor. However, more seriously, these are important times, and we are facing some pretty big problems. And for all the talk of big ideas, change and transformation, it's very clear that we are not ahead of the game. So we have a serious purpose here. We do need to get to grips with where we are at, how we got here, and where we want to go, whether that be in relation to the family, the economy, America, medicine, the arts, or even urban design, if that's your thing. Didn't work, did it? No, never mind. Too many urban designers in the audience.
You're saying that in the wrong place, mate.
However, the politicians' and policy makers' response to the current situation is to argue for more transparency, more oversight, more regulation, not just of bankers' bank balances, but of our waistlines, our carbon footprint, and how we bring up our children. I do not find that inspiring, and I know that many other people think the same. So surely we must do a whole lot better if we want to really enjoy our lives and explore our full creative potential as human beings. So as Claire Fox says in the introduction to this year's brochure, it is time to get serious. I hope you enjoy yourselves doing it. Please now go to the debates that you wish to participate in. In this room will be the battle for truth. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this opening keynote controversy debate at the Battle of Ideas 2008, the Battle for Truth. I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas. And we're obviously taking on a rather big subject to start us off today. Truth is undoubtedly a slippery concept, and it's certainly been mired in intellectual controversy over recent years. Whether it was the postmodern assault on the truth, or even in my profession these days, journalism, where the idea that the news can attempt to show the truth is ridiculed as unrealistic. Certainly there's some confusion about what truth is, and one of the reasons why I wanted to organise this session was when I read something and I realised that there's such a thing called the truth movement, and that they are 9/11 truthers who end up being the conspiracy theorists who think that the American government created 9/11. And I thought it was fantastic that they call themselves the truth movement, and it indicated that we at least are confused about what the truth is. Earlier this year, Damien Thompson brought out a book here in the UK called Counter Knowledge that took up such conspiracy theories and contrast counter knowledge to the modern scientific method. And those of us, at least in the UK, are familiar with things like the MMR controversy, the controversy about whether you should whether you should have your children vaccinated and so on. And it seemed that no matter what evidence was put forward, people didn't believe it. They didn't think it was the truth. And indeed, that kind of discussion around, for example, alternative medicine and all sorts of things is something we're all familiar with, that regardless of the evidence, people say, I don't believe it. There's also been a lot of controversy here, but of course, maybe more so in the United States, about the issue of creationism. But here, the issue of creationism, a kind of argument about what is the truth in terms of why we're here as humanity, actually recently took the scalp of the head of education at the Royal Society in this country, and is obviously constantly argued over and fought over in the States. So there's an awful lot to talk about, and as though that weren't bad enough, I've told my speakers that they've got 7 to 9 minutes, absolutely maximum, and I, in advance, suggest that that's not fair and that there's no way they can do the subject justice. But I'm absolutely delighted with the panel we've assembled. They're going to all speak for 7 to 9 minutes each. We're going to have a short conversation up here amongst ourselves just to kind of cross-fertilise some ideas. But as always with Battle of Ideas events, we'll then go out to the audience. Not so much for questions to the panel, but for your contributions and your thoughts on the question. Obviously, you haven't got 7 to 9 minutes. And there is a reason why I've invited these people up here and not you. No disrespect. On the other hand, I'm not just going to say, ask questions. I'm also going to take bundles of thoughts from you and then just get our panel to respond to anything they want to pick up on. Now, the other thing I wanted to just say about the panel before I introduce them is, broadly speaking, you could say that we've kind of got, a rationalist, a secularist, a religious person, a scientist, and a sociologist, and it would be very easy to typecast and pigeonhole. But as it goes, I don't really know what any of them are going to say, and I think it's important that we just have an open-ended discussion about this issue. First of all, let me introduce, in the order they're speaking, Susan Jacoby. Susan has flown over for the festival and to launch the British publication of her latest book, The Age of American Unreason, published by Old Street Publishing here. People may well have, and I'm sure you did, read her interesting article in the Times yesterday, and has given us food for thought about what is happening in America and the Age of Unreason, and it's incredibly pertinent to the discussion here this morning. Susan is an independent scholar. Her work focuses on American intellectual history. She's a program director for the Center for Inquiry in New York City, a rationalist think tank, and she's a regular panelist on Faith, a website sponsored by the Washington Post and Newsweek. Can we give Susan a great warm welcome, please? Next up after Susan, we'll hear from David Jones, who's a professor of bioethics at St. Mary's University College, Twickenham. His book, The Soul of the Embryo, was shortlisted for the Michael Ramsey Prize for Theological Writings, and his most recent book is Approaching the End, a Theological Exploration of Death and Dying. David has acted as an advisor to the Roman Catholic bishops of England and Wales on a range of questions, and he's also been involved in such thorny questions as organ donation, bioethics, the human tissue bill, the embryo bill, and many more things. Can we give David a big welcome, please? Sitting next to me here, we have Colin Blakemore, who I know will be well known to many of you, as he's one of the UK's, maybe the world's, best known and most distinguished scientists. He's widely admired, indeed loathed by some, for his arguments in defence of testing on animals, and has bravely never backed down in the face of intimidation on that question. He's a professor of neurosciences at the University of Oxford. He holds a professorship at the University of Warwick and a neuroscience research partnership in Singapore. Before that, he was the chief executive of the Medical Research Council, and he was recently appointed the chair of the Food Standards Agency's new advisory committee on science. I have to say about Colin, I've been trying to get him to the Battle of Ideas since we started 4 years ago. This is the first time, and we're delighted to have him. Can we give him a big welcome? And finally, Frank Furedi, Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent in Canterbury. He's a Battle of Ideas regular and is backed by popular demand. He's one of the foremost public intellectuals in Europe, a professional sociologist. He's never obscure and arcane, which is good for a sociologist, and he regularly appears in media outlets, explaining very complicated ideas to the rest of us and making sense of the world. At last year's festival, he launched his widely praised book, Invitation to Terror, The Expanding Empire of the Unknown. And at this year's festival, it marks the republication and updating of his 2001 bestseller, Paranoid Parenting. In that sense, he writes about a whole range of issues and is very much a Renaissance man. Can we give Frank Furedi a big welcome? I'm now going to ask Susan Jacoby to start us off. Thank you, Susan.
Well, to show you how fungible truth can be, I was absolutely convinced that we had only 6 minutes for this. I actually timed myself so I wouldn't go over because I thought there would be an egg timer. But I'm delighted to know I can go on to a few other hobby horses. Yeah, in my life as a professional writer, I've been assigned many improbable tasks by editors, but I must say that the most difficult assignment I've ever received was this morning's mission to sum up the battle for truth, whether in 6 or 7 or 8 minutes, whichever it is. However, the program's description of this panel's subject was a great help to me because I strongly disagree with nearly every one of its premises. The introduction to this discussion asserts that and this is a direct quote, "In recent years, there has been a backlash against relativism and a reassertion of truth claims. From Al Gore's touting of scientific consensus against climate change skeptics to Pope Benedict XVI's railing against postmodernism in the name of religious truth, there is a palpable yearning for certainty in an uncertain world. Politicians increasingly look to the science, data passed off as truth, to legitimize evidence-based policies, meaning that argument is replaced by conflicting research findings. Others argue that religious faith is essential to a fulfilling life, and some scientists have responded by challenging religious truth claims," unquote. Finally, the program notes ask us, if all you can rely on is dry facts, what hope is there for passionate and substantive political debate? Now, I assume that this description was meant to be merely provocative, because I've rarely seen so many misguided assumptions in one short text. Assumptions that, in my view, embody much of the anti-rationalism that flourishes not only in your former colonies on the other side of the ocean, but clearly in the mother country as well. The first flaw in this logic is the equation of truth with certainty, and the idea that scientific consensus is somehow the philosophical equivalent of Pope Benedict's reassertion of the traditional Vatican position that theirs is the one true church. It takes more than ecumenical luncheons to make the Pope consider even a kissing cousin like the Archbishop of Canterbury, much less secularists, anything more than heretics. The relationship of scientific consensus to religious truth claims is roughly equivalent to the relationship between an architectural engineer and a client who wants to build a dream house upon marshland only 1 kilometer from the sea. The client has his dream, or truth if you will, but it's the job of the engineer to figure out, through surveying and mathematical calculations, whether the dream is an attainable reality or whether, if construction is attempted, the fantasy palace will sink shortly into a watery grave. Now, truth in science, unlike absolutist religious truth, claims that deal in unprovable supernatural belief, scientific truth is always provisional. What a real scientist means by truth is, on the basis of all the available evidence today, which includes observation and experimentation, we're 99% or 99.5% certain, but not certain. But because scientific findings and scientific consensus are always open to challenge from new findings, the scientist can never close his or her mind to the possibility that new evidence will upset an old consensus. And that, by the way, is the main reason why scientists find it difficult to explain themselves to the general public in any country. It's very much engaged in this controversy over the MMR vaccine, which in fact is one thing that you have exported to us rather than the other way around. It doesn't matter how many scientific studies compare the rate of autism in children who've been immunized against the unimmunized. Heartbroken parents understandably refuse to believe it because they don't understand the difference between coincidence and causation. Now, there is a hunger for certainty, and once you admit the truth that you cannot be absolutely certain, then you can only have a consensus of learning and evidence that comes as close to certainty as human beings can get. And when you admit that, you're in trouble with people who were certain the universe was created in 6 days, or that the melting snows of Kilimanjaro have nothing at all to do with the actions of our species. Why climate change may even be part of a divine plan. Perhaps the sun is actually moving closer to the earth, and so there's really nothing to be done about any of this before we all turn to cinders. The second error in this presentation is the notion that evidence-based policies involve the replacement of argument with conflicting research findings. Conflicting research findings don't replace argument. They simply form a more rational basis for argument than truth claims that boil down to, I'm right and you're wrong. How do I know? I know. However, I should note that conflicting findings on everything from the conclusions of government intelligence agencies to medicine are rarely as conflicting as they appear to be when presented by ignorant analysts, many of them in the media. Many research results that appear to be in conflict actually involve bogus equivalency between well-designed scientific studies and junk science that doesn't deserve to be given equal weight. And the media, of course, can always find someone who insists that 2 + 2 = 5 to challenge those musty old evidence-based mathematicians who continue to maintain that 2 + 2 actually equals 4. In the political realm, conflicts of research findings may simply mean that those in power don't want to look at evidence that contradicts their truth claims, as was the case when the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was offered as the reason to go to war and depose Saddam Hussein. Of course, available evidence at any given moment can simply be wrong as opposed to being willfully distorted. All I can say on the basis of both remote and proximate history is that the harm done in public life by competing truth claims is far greater than the harm done by policies based on closely scrutinized evidence that may be modified. And furthermore, the argument that religion is essential to a fulfilling life has nothing to do with truth. Of course, religion is essential to a fulfilling life for many people. To others, it's merely a substitute for a fulfilling life on earth and a promise of what we may expect in the sweet by and by, as an old American hymn goes. But whether religion is essential to a fulfilling life doesn't really have anything to do, let's say, between competing truth claims of Islam and Roman Catholicism. Nothing. But the greatest fallacy of all is that there's no hope for passionate and substantive political debate if all you can rely on are dry facts. Why are facts assumed to be dry? The stars are as much a physical reality today as they've always been, and they're no less awe-inspiring because we now understand, or at least some of us understand, that their position and formation has no effect on human fortunes. Passion and reason inevitably looks to evidence, don't necessarily stand in opposition to each other, and when they do, that's when we need to be very, very afraid. You can have a passionate debate with or without facts, but you cannot have a substantive debate without facts, or research findings, if you will. In one of the most famous passages of the New Testament, it appears only in the Gospel of John, Jesus tells Pilate, "For this cause I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth, and everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice." Then Pilate asked Jesus, "What is truth?" And the Jesus portrayed in John had the good sense to remain silent. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for such an excellent start and some of your own provocations to the provocation in the brochure. David, your thoughts?
Thank you very much. I think it was Alistair McIntyre who said facts, like wigs for gentlemen, were invented in the 17th century. The notion that truth is about the accumulation of facts. Facts exist and then we accumulate them and that's what the truth is, or that 2 + 2 = 4 is a paradigm of a fact or of a truth, and we collect such truths. I think it's not fair to the historical truth of how science develops, and it's not true. It's not a very good description of the variety of disciplines which look at the truth of the human being. Go back to Aristotle. The truths that are most important to us are most difficult to find. So there are truths, I think. There are truths out there which are truths about how we should live. And that's not just about the accumulation of facts. That's about having a deeper sense of what it is to be human, and that we have to find through debate, through dialogue. And there is a truth out there, I think, but not of that sort. But we find it partly through debate. A problem when it comes to religious truth in particular, but it's not just about religious truths, that people often have, I find, is that they import truth claims which make sense in one discipline or in one area into another. And it's not true that there's no debate within within theology. If you look in the history of theology, it's constant debate, constant disagreements, but it's disagreements within their own discipline and according to their own authorities and according to their own canons and so on. And it's not always easy to transpose those to even to a different religion, let alone to secular debate. But there is still debate. And also within science there's debate. A problem I have sometimes with the science-religion debate idea is that, ironically, I think that people trying to turn science into a religion, I mean, that's a sort of problem I have. I think it's a problem which, ironically, in a way, goes back all the way to Galileo. Galileo is often seen as a paradigm of the scientist versus the religious authorities. So you have the religious authorities who persecute Galileo. Galileo is a scientist. Galileo, of course, is also a religious person. I mean, part of his penance was he had to say the office for this, which he had an illegitimate daughter who was a nun, and she said it for him. But he was certainly a very religious person, and I don't think he would have recognized this division of science and religion. But also, he thought that his main battle was with other scientists. And what irritated him were religious people who had actually become attached to a certain scientific view, the Ptolemaic view, giving that scientific view a quasi-religious authority. And I think that's a problem which is not just religious people have. That we have a scientific view, whatever it is, which may be quite well established, but it isn't sacrosanct. It isn't immune from criticism, and it gets a sort of mythical status. And it's, if we're supposed to be controversial, Colin and I have shared a couple of platforms before in the area of stem cell research, and I was deeply upset 2 days ago at a debate, a very poor level of debate, I thought, in the House of Lords, over an issue which was not about whether you should have stem cell research or not. It was about consent, or it should have been about consent, but it wasn't. They were just rehearsing the old, oh, you should have the status of the embryo is very special. Oh, it's not very special. Oh, it is very special. And stem cells are going to cure all diseases. Oh, they're not going to cure all diseases. Well, we don't really know, so we've got to try it, and that sort of thing. But people weren't saying, yes, but is it reasonable to take your cells without your consent? Is it reasonable to take the cells of people who have given cells before without your consent? And that was a different issue, and that was an issue which really wasn't being talked about. And I think partly, ironically, because the science involved had ceased to be ordinary science. It ceased to be like immunological research or research in surgery or research in pharmacology, where people say, yes, there are real benefits which can come to this, but also we need to do it properly and ethically. And so we have ethical rules about what you can do, and then you work within those. But we are getting real benefits, and we know what the benefits are, but the benefits aren't, well, we're still all going to die, and we're still going to die of something, and we're trying our best, and we have things which will help, but they'll help a bit. The problem with stem cell research, I think, is that we don't know what it'll do, and because we don't know what it'll do, it's become a sort of utopian, it's going to cure all the diseases, which is not true, and that it's become almost immune from criticism, almost immune from the sorts of ethical principles which you would apply to other sorts of science. I think that if we treat it more like science, ironically, if we've treated it as though it had no special ethical commitment at all with regards to the embryo, I think actually we'd find more strictures than there are at the moment, because what's happened is it's turned into this quasi-religious thing. And I think that's a problem I have, is that if you're going to do the science, then the science will be modest and it will be beneficial, but it also has to be integrated with a sense of what the human good is, what the rights of people are, and different views about the rights of people. And people, I think, sometimes mischaracterize other groups because they're not really familiar with their own discipline. So it's quite common for, I get rather fed up with scientists telling me what religious people think or what religion is, when it's a different discipline. It's a different discipline. And I'm no doubt a lot of scientists get very irritated about people who are not scientifically literate telling them about how promising or not promising something is, or what it means for something to be promising. History is its own discipline. Theology is its own discipline. There are many sciences, not just one. There are natural sciences and human sciences. And the truths which are most important to us are difficult to get at. And the truths which are most important to us we can only get actually through dialogue of many disciplines. So I'd have a plea for truth, but a plea not for short-circuiting the debate. I must say, the speaker on my left was very critical of the words in the introduction about truth. But in her article, which I enjoyed in the Times, which is about religion in America, American fundamentalism. I've got to wind up. American fundamentalism, it admitted that fundamentalism isn't a word which the people who it describes like. So it's not a self-description, and it's also a word which is heavily loaded. And to use a word which is heavily loaded is actually to appeal to unreason. It's a form of unreason. The word fundamentalist was used 16 times in the article. And I don't think that's reason. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We like to encourage close reading of the text. Thank you very much, David. A completely contrary view there. And now over to Colin Blakemore. Colin.
Worth pointing out, just in response, I know this is not the time for the debate, but that the word fundamentalism was actually conceived in the United States in the 1920s as the result of the writings of...
The editor cut that out.
Okay, there you are. 1920s, a group of creationist, fundamental Baptist believers who produced a series of tracts called the Fundamentals, and that's the origin of the word. It's interesting to reflect on the kinds of debates and discussions that allowed the birth of the scientific method. The debates that circulated around the work of Galileo and later the writings of Francis Bacon in this country, they were predicated on an assumption that curiosity, the curiosity that drives science, was justified by Scripture. That scientists, natural philosophers, were in a sense doing the work of God, either by utilizing the powers of reason that had been given to human beings by God, or following God's instructions to discover about the nature of the world, for one thing, to prepare them for the second coming. Interesting that, as it were, science had to be justified on the basis of Scripture. I would make the argument that science is distinctly different from other belief or truth systems in that it is not predicated on a pre-existing ideology or a set of pre-existing beliefs, unlike, for instance, those who oppose the use of animals in research because they have a particular ethical stance about what we should do to animals. Perfectly reasonable, but it should then not be used to justify whether a particular approach in science is valid or not. Or those who are skeptical about, say they are skeptical about evidence for climate change because they might be motivated by political or economic factors. Ideally, and I'll paint an idealistic picture of science, not one that I could completely defend, but let's start with a singular position. Science is not a body of claimed truth. Science is a discovered method or set of methods for adducing evidence. It doesn't and shouldn't generate dogmatic truth statements. Ideally, it should not be ideologically motivated. What it does is to establish a moving and evolving set of established scientific views, theories, which, of course, can become enriched by continuing accumulation of evidence, or can be violently and dramatically overthrown by critical experiments. By falsification in the terminology of Popper, leading to what Thomas Kuhn called a scientific revolution, a change in the established established view. So science is not a set of absolutely dogmatic truth statements. It is an accumulated body of evidence that leads to theories that are more or less supported by a community of experts who recognize that even the most established views that we have could in principle be overturned by critical new evidence. I had an interesting experience at the Creation Museum in Kentucky a few weeks ago. I was talking to the resident physicist at the Creation Museum, because the Creation Museum, as I'm sure you know, is a sort of wonderful biblical Disneyland that paints a spookily convincing picture with modern graphics and animated scenarios, better than at Disneyland, paints a picture of a sort of Genesis version of the creation of the world, with computer graphics of the flood, with little scenarios of people, very well dressed, early hominids, with dinosaurs in the back garden, and so on. The resident physicist, young guy, has a PhD, I think, from Boulder, University of Colorado. He is an expert in sun weather systems. And I had an interesting discussion with him about the nature of scientific evidence, what his beliefs were about the universe, for instance. Absolutely firm view. The Earth was created about 6,500 years ago in 6 days. Yes, human beings and dinosaurs did coexist because all life was created simultaneously, and pretty much simultaneously, and so on. And I said, well, why do science if you have all this pre-existing set of absolutely firm convictions? He said, well, science is fine, we're using our minds given to us by God. And I said, but then, the vast majority of people in your field of research believe that the universe is billions of years old, not 6,500 years old. What do you do when you do, and that is based on a massive amount of evidence, what do you do when you find scientific evidence, you as a scientist, that contradicts biblical views? And he says, it's very simple, it must be wrong. We just go back, do the science again, in the end, we'll find the right answer. I mean, we have additional information that qualifies the interpretation of scientific evidence in Scripture. Because if we gather scientific evidence that clearly contradicts Scripture, we know we've made a mistake with the experiments. I mean, it'd be great if that were true, of course, although in a sense it would mean that it wasn't really worth doing the science at all. How can we ask whether, if we try to ask whether science provides solid knowledge about the world, I think, ultimately the test of that has to be empirical. It works. No one would appeal to science, comes out of new age mysticism or write a horoscope if they wanted to launch a space vehicle to Mars or design a new nuclear power plant or even a refrigerator. I mean, these are based on the established corpus of scientific beliefs about physics. It works. And there is no other belief system or truth system which can make things, that do things, and that work. Science is effective and it works. Sarah Palin, who might, next week be a new vice president of the most powerful country in the world, has stated that not only does she have very firm, rather old-fashioned and scary views about Scripture, but also that she's strongly in support of the Star Wars anti-ballistic missile system. Well, it has been said, of course, then, the Pentagon will be required to recalculate the trajectories of missiles on the assumption that the Earth is flat. I just want to make two brief points about why it is that people are skeptical of science. Why do they have this paradoxical attitude to science? And I'm talking about, non-experts. On the one hand, they admire science. 80% of the public, poll after poll, 80% of the public admire the power and respect the power of science. They know from the empirical evidence it works, it does things, it provides their fridge and sends things to the moon and so on. And yet they are still skeptical about it and its ways of working, about the individual observations of science. I think it's very clear, because we come with a package of ways, biologically endowed, with a package of ways of trying to adduce evidence about the world. We come with a package of curious ways of interpreting probabilities, which are totally incorrect. They kind of work for us. But there's no reason, of course, why the evolutionary process should have discovered the scientific method. It didn't. It discovered a way of people kind of getting around in the world, surviving in a reasonable way on the basis of personal experiences and generalized sort of false probabilistic interpretation. And secondly, why are people skeptical of science? I think it's because they confuse the scientific method with the ethical problems which are so often generated by the use of scientific evidence. They mix the problems and the dilemmas about how we should use the power that we have that's derived from science, from the actual process of gathering that scientific evidence, and it's the scientists who tend to get the blame, the kinds of issues that David is quite right to air about embryo research are not, as it were, a problem for science. Science is neutral, ethically neutral, but constantly it throws up issues that scientists are not qualified, and they're equally entitled to express views, but they're not qualified to make decisions about. Those are the ethical issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Colin. That's very useful. And final thoughts from Frank Furedi.
Thanks very much. I think it's quite important that we don't confuse the idea of truth and the pursuit of truth with a debate about or between religion and science, because truth is really much more than that. And there are very good reasons why throughout human history people have passionately searched for the truth and tried to pursue the truth. It's also important to understand that truth cannot be reduced to facts or to bits of information, because truth and the idea of truth captures a dimension of human experience through the act of interpretation. It's more than just describing a particular event. It involves, above all, the experience of meaning. What do we mean? What is the meaning of particular dimensions of human life? That's really where our concerns about truth really begin to click in. And it's interesting that although people today still yearn for the truth, and in some sense, some people very one-sidedly pursue it, nevertheless, overall as a society, we have become very skeptical about the truth. And time again, there's a sense of cynicism, a kind of sense that this is really for very naive provincial people to be concerned about, not something that sophisticated London intellectuals would ever spend very much time discussing. And it's interesting also that precisely at a time when knowledge has expanded exponentially, the status of the truth has become downside, and fairly systematically. And some people tell me that skepticism towards the truth is a very healthy, positive reaction to close-minded dogmatism. And it's a really positive reaction because there are all these people looking for the truth who refuse to yield to new experience. They're very close-minded and will not consider any other ideas. Others tell me that truth with a capital C is impossible in a world like ours, which changes all the time. It's continually in flux. And where ideas and truths lose their relevance very, very fast. And therefore what we need is a more modest, provisional orientation towards the truth. And I remember I was in Rome very recently and I talked about the truth. And this guy gets up and says, "Furedi, you're the only person I know that believes in the truth," expecting the whole audience to laugh, that basically you would laugh if you believed in the truth with a capital T. And it seems to me that there's a very good reason why it is that we are the way we are with truth at the moment. And I think it's got to do with the fact that our society has a very easy relation to the truth, because our society finds it very difficult to give experience meaning. I think one of the beautiful things about the truth, if you pursue it, is that it raises uncertainty in its most tangible way. It forces you to face uncertainty in its face. And I think all of us find that a little bit difficult to handle. And on a societal level, these days, uncertainty has become something that we try to abolish through risk management and a whole host of instruments that we've developed, including subprime mortgages, in the recent periods. Now, what I find that has happened is this. One of the most regrettable consequences of our difficulty in endowing human experience with meaning is that increasingly science is used and has been hijacked to bypass the need to deal with it. It's a bit like the man from Del Monte. When the man from Del Monte says, yes, we put our hands up. Similarly, when science says yes, it's got to be true. And that's the way these things are kind of perceived. Certainly as somebody devoted towards academic research, I've now come to the point where I shudder every time I open a newspaper and the article begins by saying research shows, sort of. Because literally every form of petty belief can be validated by research shows. So last month, a study by Dr. John Alford from Rice University conclusively proved that right-wing Americans are likely to be far more nervous than their left-wing counterparts. Liberals in the audience will be delighted to discover that they are typically relaxed and chilled out. And we know that this is true because this cutting-edge research interviewed as many as 46 people. There was also good news for people of faith last month. Researchers at Oxford have discovered that belief in God works as a wonderful form of pain relief. On the basis of testing, listen to this, 12 Roman Catholics and 12 atheists, they concluded that believers can draw on their reservoir of spirituality to endure suffering with far greater fortitude than unimaginative atheists. And of course, this was no news to the Anglican Bishop of Durham, who observed that the practice of faith should, and in many cases, does alter the person you are. If you picked up a copy of Science early October, you will have discovered that religion also turns people into honest, generous, and trusting citizens. So there you have it. Now, to some extent, we can laugh and say this is just the media using science in a slightly politicized way. But all that I know is that every time I talk to a new Labour politician, after 5 or 10 minutes, they will inform me that the latest brain research has shown that the reason why some men are homophobic is because the left side of their brain is twisted this way. Then somebody comes along and says, the latest brain research shows that the reason why some children are very sociable is because the left side or the right side of their brain is this way. And if you actually were to add up all these new brain research shows, documents that have been published, literally every aspect of our life can be accounted for by our brains or by our genetics and all the rest of that. So I do think we have to understand that we live in a world where we are continually using science in this silly kind of a way, and it is important to realize, and especially in an audience such as this, that the science is not the truth. Science is not the truth. Science provides us with the intellectual resources to pursue the truth, if that's what you want to do, but you don't have to do it. But science itself is not the truth. And of course, in many respects, what's important about the truth is not the truth itself, but the act of its discovery, the act of its pursuit. I think that's what makes us passionate in the language of our brief here. That's what gives us the buzz, the pursuit of the truth, because it is through its pursuit that we become both aware of our humanity and also become aware of the circumstances that we're living in. Now, obviously, what's exciting about the pursuit of the truth is that we end up looking for answers to questions that excite our imagination, but we often end up with answers to very different questions than the ones we set out with. And it's through coming up against these unexpected answers, which kind of sneak up upon us, that science, as well as other forms of thought, really come into their own. And I think overall, as a human species, we've really benefited from that. But one of the problems that we're faced with is that because of our estrangement from truth, and because we find it very difficult to give meaning to life, we always think that meaning is a word that only religious people can use, and us secular people must never stray into that territory. We become also very downbeat about its pursuit. And I think those two things go hand in hand. It's not only the truth that we feel uncomfortable with, but even its pursuit. I know, for example, as an academic, as a sociologist, if I want to pursue my truth, I have to deal with ethics committees. And I don't know if you ever dealt with an ethics committee in university, but these are people who can barely spell the word ethic, never actually understand it, and who will give you the most incredible objections. For example, literally every important piece of criminological or sociological research that was carried out in the interwar period could not be carried out now. I mean, our ethics committee would simply forbid that. That is, to me, a very tangible way in which the truth is stigmatized, its pursuit is stigmatized. Look at the way that our society and our culture regards experimentation, which is one of the most important ways we pursue the truth. If you want to know what experimentation means to us, just go on Google and put on scientific experiments, and you will find immediately the word Frankenstein comes up, Nazi Germany comes up. I mean, all the most horrific manifestations, perversions of experimentation will hit you kind of straight away. And I know that every time I'm involved in a debate about the pursuit of truth, somebody sooner or later turns on me and says, Frank, you're playing God. You know, you're playing God. The very idea that you have the ambition to pursue the truth without any of its barriers is often kind of reacted to in that way. I just want to end up by making one important point, which is, as Susan was saying, the truth is not about certainty. It is, in fact, about uncertainty, which is why it's such an exciting concept. It is about our ability to make sense of our circumstances in times that are very uncertain. And I think it's that dialectic, that tension between the two, that we should embrace in the way that we discuss and debate this particular subject.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to come back straight away to Susan to see if there's anything you want to respond to directly. And while she's doing that, also just sort of say, or pose a question to the panel, or my initial question, which is, there is something disconcerting about the way, for example, science is used to close down debate. I mean, the number of times people say to me, it's the science, stupid. I mean, that's the inference, you know, you idiot. It's the science. And it's almost as though when you... by the way, because I'm not a scientist, you can imagine that I'm trying to have a conversation or a discussion about politics or the world. And actually the response, also, by the way, from non-scientists is, it's the science, stupid. But isn't that a rather dangerous way of kind of using science and in terms of the pursuit of truth? But Susan, is there anything directly you want to come back on?
Well, yes, first of all, it is dangerous if you use science that way, and only stupid and ignorant people use science that way. The research studies that were cited involving 46 people, one of the things that's wrong with our ability to analyze anything is no experiment on 36 people, no set of questions of 36 people tells you anything. And anyone who understands the scientific method knows that. So this is why I think it's entirely wrong to say that people like me make a religion out of science. Far from it. Science moves from an idea, an imagination, what might be known, toward the limits of what we can't know, which, as you say, are quite limited. I'd just like to add one thing about fundamentalism being an unreasonable word. The fact that fundamentalists don't like it has nothing to do with that it's unreasonable. They invented the term in America around 1911 in a book called The Fundamentalists. They don't like it because it is a literal description. They believe that every word in the Bible is literally true. When I said that 1/3 of Americans say that they believe that every word in the Bible is literally true, one thing you may all have been confused about, which I tried to explain in my piece, is evangelical is often used as a synonym for fundamentalist. The American press is responsible for this largely, by the way. And there are many evangelicals, as I mentioned, former President Carter and many others, who are not fundamentalists. That is, they regard the Bible as a metaphor. Roman Catholics, by and large, are not fundamentalists either, as we know from what many popes have had to say about evolution. And indeed, the fact that the Church's views on many biblical issues are mediated through clerical authority was one of the reasons there was a Reformation, or a schism, as you might say. But fundamentalist itself is not a pejorative word. American fundamentalists don't like it because it has become a pejorative word to non-fundamentalists. But what I mean by a fundamentalist is someone who believes, again, that every word in the Bible is literally true. And just one more thing. Facts, poor old facts. Of course, the truth can't be reduced to facts, but you can't have any truth without facts.
Okay, thank you. Colin, just on my question, just in terms of the science being used in a way to close down the pursuit of truth. Do you recognise that at all?
Of course, and I don't completely agree with Susan that it's only non-scientists who use those kinds of arguments, I'm afraid. I mean, there is a perverted form of the legitimate scientific establishment view. That is the current prevailing majority opinion of experts. And an extreme version of that is indeed the attempt to shut down debate, both within science and between science and, as it were, the outside community, on the basis of that established view, as if it were absolute truth. And it's very unfortunate when scientists themselves use scientific evidence and argument in those ways.
Okay, thanks. Is there anything you want to respond to, David? I mean,
I'd like to respond to the notion that science works, and perhaps use another image of a relationship of science and religion, and that's the most Catholic town in Japan is Nagasaki. It's got a Catholic mayor. It's deeply religious, actually, in not a very religious country. And I believe that actually the cathedral in Nagasaki was used to cite as the citing position for the atomic bomb, which was dropped on Nagasaki. Now that's science that worked, in a way, but there's a question of we can do things. Science can help us to do things. But every country in the world has its scientists, and they can produce all sorts of things which we use for good, and things which we use for harm. But in order to have a direction in life, we need something which is bigger than science. We need something that's bigger than science. That's all.
Susan, do you want to respond to that?
I find this an extraordinary example of the speciousness of religious argument. So what if the cathedral in Nagasaki was used as a target for the atomic bomb? And I'm one of those who have a lot of historical questions in hindsight, particularly about whether the bomb should have been dropped on Nagasaki. Mm-hmm. What is your point? Who says that science can't be used for good or harm? That has nothing to do with whether science works at all. Of course, it is the job of all of us, not just scientists, to decide how we use science. Mm-hmm. And that would be true of embryonic stem cell research at all. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I also think that your argument that one of the big arguments against embryonic stem cell research is we don't know what sort of a benefit it's going to provide. Well, you could have said that about almost every advance in the history of science.
Okay, David, I'll let you come back first.
And that's why I think this debate between religion and science is actually a false one. It's a useful and important debate, but it's really about something else, because truth is really about meaning, right? That's really what it's all about. And the problem that we have in contemporary society is that we have a lot of difficulty in giving meaning to everyday experience. We end up bypassing that issue through in the realm of public policy by going towards evidence-based politics. We don't say this is good or bad. We say this is evidence-based. We time and time again, refuse to acknowledge, what kind of values there are that we want to uphold. And we seem to imagine that only religious people can have those things, and us secular people, are going to become somehow destroyed if we move into that domain. And I am worried about that, because you do end up with a very caricatured version of secularism. And one of the things I find troubling being a European looking at America is not what the fundamentalists say, because I would expect people of that persuasion to be into creation and all the rest of that stuff. But the reaction to it, which is often as Philistine and as dumbed down as their opponents, and it is very disappointing when you find liberal thinking, secular people having their own mirror image prejudices with which they engage in this discussion. And I do think we need to rise above this a little bit and have a more grown-up, mature discussion.
Okay, David, Colin?
Just the image which I evoked was meant to be an image which was meant to be shocking. It wasn't meant to be an argument as such. And I'm sorry if you took it as an argument. For me, it was just a shocking image of a juxtaposition of two things, which I hope you might generate meaning from.
Okay, thanks, Colin.
Well, can I just respond to that very briefly? So I think we're confusing two uses of the word right. The right in the sense of morally right, and right in the sense of correct, verifiable, and that's a very important distinction. We don't have, good lexicon for making that distinction. It's crucially important. Touches on the issue I was trying to raise about the distinction between scientific evidence and its in an ideal world neutrality, and the ethical and moral issues that are thrown up by its applications. But I do want to pick up, I have a lot of time for Frank's writings and views, but I think he is completely misdirected in his focus on meaning as being something which is, as it were, beyond the potential of the scientific method to address. He actually told a story deriding the notion that literally, and to quote, literally every aspect of our lives can be explained by knowledge of the brain, that of our behavior, that is. Well, what other forms of explanation of our behavior could there be apart from the properties of the organ that generates behavior? Now, it has to distinguish between the depth of ignorance that we still have about many processes in the universe, particularly about ourselves, because we just haven't got there yet with science, and the possibility that there are things in the universe or in ourselves that are, as it were, beyond the possibility of science providing explanations. I mean, I'm not in that camp. I mean, there are those who think, there are forms of knowledge that science is just not competent to address, that science is just one way of tackling the explanation of the world, that there are questions, often questions that begin with the word why, that science is simply not competent to address. Science does the how questions, something else answers the why questions. I'm not there. I think science is a universal method of explanation of everything, and until we have overwhelming evidence to contradict that view, well, why not carry on doing what science has been doing inexorably for 400 years, and that is just explaining things.
Also, I'm interested in the musical example that you used, because perhaps I have a broader definition of facts, and maybe this dry facts idea is something that makes the word facts unacceptable to a lot of people. To me, music is a fact. And what is music if not a wonderful achievement of the human brain? And what is our ability to be moved by music but a wonderful achievement of the human brain? And I don't care if you call it a soul, or I call it a spirit, or someone else calls it a brain. Music is a fact. When you listen to the music of Bach, how can not? This is the most orderly music, and how that order and how the mathematics upon which music is based too, how that translates into our emotions. Well, I would say that is something we are a long way from understanding, and it may not even be important to understand it. But it is a fact that we are moved that way, and anymore, I don't see how can a scientific worldview be opposed to meaning in that way. The same thing that a primitive person didn't understand what the stars meant, and he looked up at the stars thousands of years ago, and whoever wrote it wrote, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge." One of the greatest lines in the King James Bible. How does that differ from the experience that we, knowing more about the stars today, feel when on those rare occasions when we can actually see them? How does that differ? And how does this in any way say that you have to have one way of looking at something that's true and another way that's science that's less complete? I don't understand this idea of this division.
Okay, Frank, very briefly come back, then I'll go out to my second question I've abandoned. Right, Frank, you just respond to that, then I'll go out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about music and all aesthetic forms of thought is that it actually predominantly relies upon intuition and relies upon qualities that give us a glimmer of something that we don't yet fully understand. They are pre-facts, and they're often pre-conscious, and often for people, they have become ways of gaining understanding. I'm a big believer in science and the scientific method, but it's important to see science in its proper place, and science is not the same thing as the other forms of public discussions that need to take place. It informs it, but we shouldn't really reduce it to it. And I think that the very idea that brain research cannot be questioned at a time when virtually every social and political experience is being reduced to sociobiology, when the government tells us that we need to have early intervention in childhood, because we now know that the brains of some children are going to dispose them towards criminal behavior, sort of later on, is in fact science turning into religion. It is a kind of predestination, I think, as you mentioned earlier on, a way of somehow you got these people who are destined to become particular individuals because this is what their brain programs them to do so. I think that at that point we do have to worry and realize that science has been hijacked from its rightful status and become something very different.
Okay, I'm going out to the audience.
Yes, the audience, yes.
You've all got a lot to say. Just one thing that I'd like you to mull over is, as well, is I started off talking about the kind of conspiracy theorists, and also there's been some reflection on creationists, particularly in America and so on. One of the things that often happens is that people say, you know, it's kind of like the growth of unreason, but also the growth of ignorance. There's a kind of...
No, that's something else.
And why is it, though, that people are susceptible in 2008, or seemingly increasingly susceptible in 2008, to unreason and, you know, obvious untruths? Is it that they're ignorant? What is the context? And so on. It would be useful to try and get a few ideas from people about that. Okay, there are microphones. Can I see the microphone? Can I just wave the microphones? Right. Okay, so I'm going to start at the front and take a couple here, and then I'll kind of go back, yeah? I'll do that kind of little row, and then if you just gather some thoughts together, I'll come back to you after I've taken about 5 or 6 people. Yeah.
James Woodhousen. I've got a very simple point. I've got a lot of time for Colin's writings, but if you take a topical issue like today, energy, you may know that according to a lot of Greens, oil is the excrement of humanity. That's how they interpret oil. But we learned recently that, in fact, energy has a different meaning. It's all about providing jobs, according to Alistair Darling. If we build enough windmills, that will revive employment in this country. How can you, Colin, reduce those two very different views of the meaning of energy? One as sort of our terrible waste and what a blight we are, and the other as energy isn't about energy, it's about jobs. Those two very different meanings of energy, I challenge you to reduce them to the neural pathways in the brain.
Okay, thank you. And moving along.
Robin White, you asked us to talk about unreason. I'd like to focus on two remarks from Colin and from Frank. You gently mock the irrationality of certain scientists in your remarks, and perhaps correctly so. What I'd like to address is the fact that irrationality is, in fact, the system that drives all of us, and that rationality in decision-making is an utter and general illusion. Brain science, good brain science, suggests that we are in fact run by a high-speed decision-making system that was built up on needs 500,000 years ago, is a hugely flawed decision-making system. The fact that we have a credit crunch now is basically driven off the fact that our brains are wired up to consider that we live for just 30 years. So our irrationality seems politically impossible for our leaders to face up to. So my question to this panel is simply this. Can you advise how we can, if you like, nudge or kludge our way, to refer to a couple of recent studies, our way to actually recognize and even better harness the profound irrationality in constructing future policy making?
Thank you very much. And that gentleman there, and I'll go back. So that gentleman there, and then I'll... Yes, okay.
I'd just like to move to a wider concept, and that is, how do we get on together as human beings? Because this is at the basis of all of this. On Wednesday, I was addressing a seminar of about 40 Christians, Muslims, Jews, and myself, an atheist humanist. The crucial thing that was not really objected to, even by the Muslims, was that religions are a human construct, that human society is a human construct, and we have to work together to improve it. Now you can begin to build on that and get the necessity of an open society in order to develop science. And it also includes the emotional aspects, the music, and the rest of it. But unless we can get on together, then we are not going to make the progress that is essential.
Thank you very much. So, guy there, and then that person there, yeah? That one there.
I just wanted to explore the discussion about weapons of mass destruction, the example that Susan gave in her introduction, because I think it's actually a really good one to show some of the tensions in this discussion. I could maybe find evidence to present to a particular president that there are no weapons of mass destruction in a certain country. And that president can then interpret my evidence one of two ways. He or she can say that's because there are no weapons of mass destruction in that country, or he or she can say that's because they're bloody good at hiding them. So it rather suggests that what matters in political decision-making is increasingly less the evidence, but rather the interpretation of that evidence according to particular frameworks, outlooks, or a sense of purpose. And maybe the problem really is that that framework or outlook emerges from a particular group being very clear as to what their interests are. But we now live in a society today where people are maybe not so clear as to what their interests are, because to identify your interest opens you up to conflict. And we live in a society where people avoid conflict more often than not, and therefore interests have become confused, and these different interpretations can operate. Alternatively to exposing yourself to a conflict, you can, if you're David, try and smuggle in interests, either consciously or unconsciously, into the discussion, but not labelling them as such. But I'm sure, David, you'd accept that you do represent a particular form of outlook, you have a particular framework for analysing the world. And maybe the problem here is that we don't want to confront those different interests today, and that's why this tension arises.
Okay, thanks. That lady there, please, yeah.
I've just got, it's quite an awkward way of putting it, but if you dream, there's a whole massive, sort of school of different sorts of thoughts about how those dreams can then represent what your own personal truth is or your own personal story is. And I was thinking of back in Arab times when the greatest sort of exploration of science was. In Islam, there was a concept called jihad, which meant that you could look at the basic principles of Islam, but after that, you were faced with new evidence and new things coming in, new ideas, a new personal circumstance, and you had to use those principles to make a new truth or make your own way, and jihad was the process of doing that. And I wondered if science in some way is like that, in the sense that you keep getting new evidence and then you keep having to look for a new truth, and you keep having to use your internal self to ask yourself the questions that will take you forward to that new truth. And it's a slightly incoherent question, but maybe you can make some sense of it.
No, thank you very much indeed. So there's that lady there, right, and then I'll take that hand in the middle, then I'm going to take everyone at the back after. So after that lady there, the person in the middle, then panel, anything you want to pick up on, then one last round out there. Okay.
Yes, there is a healthy sort of scepticism towards the truth in many areas, including in the media and within journalism itself. But in a lot of debates that I go to on journalism, few journalists say, I don't believe in the truth, even if they have a sort of slightly sceptical approach. They say, no, I believe in the truth. I always try and be accurate. What they actually start objecting to is when you mention the word objectivity. That never exists, apparently. We're all subjective now. We all bring our own bias as reporters. So what it seems to me is there's quite a sort of sophisticated confusion around the truth in a way, that on the one hand, the scope of the truth to explain the world is perceived as quite a narrow ability, within the media debates anyway. And secondly, that the sort of the method to use rationality and logic to discover the truth is heavily questioned.
Okay, thanks. So that person in the middle, where's that hand gone?
Yeah,
Yes,
I picked up a book here last year called The Importance of Truth, and I consider myself someone who sort of stickler for truth. So I was enjoying reading it, and then it got to a point where it said, started attacking the left and left idealism, and saying, basically, this is distancing yourself from reality, from truth, what's real, and it's like a huge deception that you have to engage in. And I wonder if the panel would like to comment on the relation that you've commented on the relationship between science and truth. What about idealism and truth?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, panel, picking up on anything at all that you want, and obviously not everything. Susan, just anything you want to kind of respond to at all?
There were so many different questions, but I'll pick up the last one, which is about the media. I think that objectivity is something. When I went to school 40 years ago, I always wanted to be a newspaper reporter. That's what I wanted to start out as. And objectivity was the ideal. And the ideal of journalism then was that there are always two sides to every question, which is certainly true in often 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. But the problem with a certain kind of journalistic objectivity is that it locates truth as always being equidistant from 2 points. And I'll give you a very good example of that and then stop because I'm sure everybody else has thoughts about this. But since you brought up the anti-vaccine movement and the MMR movement, invariably American television is giving a great deal of coverage to this, has for some years. This controversy started in England before it moved to the United States. One of the few things in which we got a bad import from you as opposed to our credit crisis. And invariably, when television does interviews, the print media are not so bad. When they do television interviews, there will be 2 people. There will be a scientist, an immunologist, and he'll be citing 16 studies, including the best one from Denmark, where they keep the most perfect health records in the world. And they compared immunized against unimmunized children and found exactly the same rates of increase in autism over the last 10 years. And then on the other side, so the scientists will be talking, and this is good research. It's not research on 46 people. It's research on thousands and thousands over a period of years. And then on the other side, there will be a parent for whom you have immense sympathy, because one of the worst things in the world that can happen to them as a parent has happened. They're apparently healthy 18-month or 2-year-old, received some kind of an immunization, and a few weeks later started to show some of the symptoms of classical autism, including withdrawal from social contact. Now, there is no way anybody is going, in other words, the belief of the parent that this is what caused it, even though, in fact, almost all symptoms of classical autism appear at this time, which is why other studies have found that there's no difference in the rates of autism at that age. But when you present it in this way by the media, and they present so many issues this way, what you are saying is the experience of one heartbroken parent has exactly the same weight as the experience of people, including pediatricians, who have been studying this subject for years because they also would like to know if vaccines cause autism. And also, there never is any historical background given, and the journalists doing the interview are too young to remember what it was like to be young when I was young, and your parents wouldn't let you go out to play in the summer because they were so terrified of polio, and thousands of children died, and tens of thousands were crippled every year by polio. So this is what I mean by this is not about truth. Objectivity of that kind is not about truth. It's about giving the nonsensical and what is closer to certainty an equal voice.
Thank you very much indeed, David.
So I can completely concur with that. I think Aristotle has this thing about virtue exists between 2 vices. So courage, we see courage is opposed to cowardice, but courage is also opposed to rashness, actually sort of going in where you ought to be a bit more cautious. Mm-hmm. But we think, so we think of one side, but there's another side too. But he says, but it's not equidistant. It's not equidistant, and that's I agree. And if I've smuggled any Roman Catholic thoughts in, I should just say that I am Roman Catholic, and I didn't mean to smuggle anything in. I just meant to say what I believed, and if I use an argument, I always try myself to say, I think this works, and if it doesn't, and somebody points that out to me, then I won't use it because I am, from my own perspective, trying to do my best to locate the truth. And clearly people disagree about things, but I think that you should listen to people, and you should, a principle of charity, you should listen to people and not automatically think you already know what they're thinking. And then if they start to speak nonsense, at that point you should jump in.
Okay, thanks. Colin?
A few things. I'd actually like just to respond to one point that David made. One of the implications in what David just said was that because something works, it is valuable, and if it works when it's not based, as it were, on scientific inference, then what it's showing is that there are other ways of explaining or making things work. That can't be right. I mean, things are, both the Islamic world and China got a very long way with technology on the one hand, mathematics and observation on the other, without really inventing science. I mean, what they did worked, but without the scientific method to produce it. Aspirin, antipsychotic drugs were used without any scientific basis. They're simply discovered empirically. It doesn't mean that science is wrong, because some forms of working are discovered by chance, independent of science. I want to respond to a couple of points. One, the very direct question to me about neural pathways explaining the opinions of the Green Movement or Alistair Darling about energy. I think there's a shallow point and a profound point here. I mean, the shallow point is that, you know, Lord Melchett's brain is presumably very substantially different from that of Alistair Darling's. And if we could understand both of them, we would have a clear interpretation of what generates their particular opinions. But the deeper point is that science actually initially, and one sees this in many areas, I mean, equally in physics and in biology, starts by trying to find communality, find simple explanations that are common to all situations, the laws of physics and so on. So, you know, brain research at the moment is very much at the stage of trying to explain, as it were, the average individual, rather than trying to explain all of you. But, you know, the agenda must ultimately be to give an equal account of the differences between individuals, as well as a common view about how brains in general work. I mean, that might be a big challenge. It might be an impossible challenge to science, but one has to distinguish between things that are just not feasible to achieve because they're too big in scale, and things that are in principle impossible for science to address. And there are some people that would say that there are such questions.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just 2 points. I just following on from this last point, I think that one of the problems that we have is that science increasingly is focused into areas that are quite inappropriate for science to be in. You know, when you have science, for example, pretending to be a science of relationship, for example, parenting scientists and parenting experts, and when you have a whole, you know, domain of education that is being sort of dominated by all these experts who claim scientific accreditation, then you know you've got a very big problem, because they're basically making moral judgments under the guise of being scientists. And I think that has become a huge problem. I think brain research, myself, is increasingly moving in that direction, and in many respects, brain research has become what the equivalent of 19th century craniology, where, again, people were meant to be very irrational. I mean, that was the dominant theme. People are very, very irrational, and the thinner their forehead, the more irrational they were. And I think that contemporary brain research, we can now explain every time you make a joke, every time you become shy, why you're bald and why you're not bald. All these things, you know, sort of do tell me as a sociologist that what we have here is a fad, you know, rather than of science. I just want to say something that will make me thoroughly unpopular with the audience here, particularly with my partner.
Okay, very quick.
Which is this. I mean, quite often I've been in radio studios, you know, talking about the panic about pedophilia, and a parent would be up there, Susan's parent would be up there arguing against me, but, you know, Frank, what if my child gets kidnapped? Now, obviously, it's a very difficult case to argue. But I do worry about a growing tendency on the part of people who say that debate can only be on my terms, and who basically, in a very undemocratic way, argue that, you know, sort of why should I, as this you know, PhD from an Ivy League university or from Oxford, have to be in the same room with this moron who's just a parent, who doesn't know very much except their circumstances. And it is a very uncomfortable situation to be in, and I've been in that situation myself. I do think that we're not just simply scientists, and we're not just simply sociologists or whatever. We are part of a public. And I think in a grown-up society, having a conversation in public is something that we should have the bravery to actually engage in. And I think it's very easy to say, those idiots, you know, they believe in creationism, those idiots, they believe in this and that. But actually, maybe our own arguments are not as persuasive or as clear as we would like it to be. Because if we had the power of logic behind us in its full flow, then it may well be the case that the emotional sort of issues raised by parents and other people who are victimized for some reason would not sway anybody. And I do think we should be a bit braver and not censor people for the simple fact that they're not scientists or sociologists or part of our elites.
Okay, a lot of tension on the panel. I can tell you.
No.
You're not tense. It's against you. Not a lot of perception on the panel. Right. There's also no time. So I've now got to kind of take, 3 quick points. Right in the middle there. That gentleman, right in the middle. Microphones have to move. Yes, well, you've got it. So
I'd just like to speak out in support of some very clear-headed thinking, I think, by Colin Blakemore and Susan Jacoby, and some rather strange things which don't have anything to do with truth, really, which David Jones has been espousing, really about moral questions and invoking rather emotive arguments. Surely truth is the nature of objective reality, and what scientists do, essentially, is use observations and evidence to build models that describe what we see. And as we push the boundaries further, we realise these models aren't good, and we modify those models, and they give us a better understanding, but not actually what objective reality is, but perhaps approximating it better. And that's what we're going towards. Okay. I just think some clear understanding of what truth is required in this debate.
Right. Couple of lines along, there's a hand. Yeah, there's a hand. Oh, yeah, okay, all right, you've got it. Yeah, I've lost control. Yeah, go on.
It's actually, I was quite surprised actually how little discussion there was recently on the panel. Because, I think we talked about truth and reasons are really central part of that subject. And I think with the point at the front about sort of being irrational, I just say speak for yourself. There's a couple of things that didn't recognise.
Speak into the... Yeah.
There's a couple of things that didn't recognise the subject description. I think it's actually scientists that provide fundamental knowledge, but it's actually engineers who make things and do things. And actually it's quite interesting. I deal with a lot of scientists and engineers and social scientists. And actually engineers, not just in their subject, but are more inclined to believe in truth than people from any other area of thought, which is quite revealing. And finally, I just think that there was a lot of talk about fundamentalism. I think often the critique of fundamentalism, in a used in a pejorative way, is actually a critique of just believing in something. I'm not afraid of the term. I believe in certain things. They're all open-ended things. I believe in humanity, I believe in rationality, I believe in the scientific method, I believe in engineering our environment, and I believe in social progress. They're all open-ended things. So.
Thank you very much. Right, that person I've been so excited whose hand I did see. Yeah, you've got the microphone now. Stand up, sir. Yeah.
I'd just like to challenge this idea that when you're conducting scientific tests on the world, that the most important thing the panels seem to believe is the quality of the empirical tests that you're using. Like, the panel made so much of the fact that the problem with a test of Vatican priests is that you're using too small a sample or whatever. But I think the point is that the reason why we have such a public scepticism of science is not that our empirical tests aren't good enough. It's the fact that the public aren't trained to ask the right questions. And we keep being told that if your empirical test is good enough, if your mathematical model is good enough, you can apply it to any situation. But I'd just like to say that's very wrong. Most members of the general public don't understand that if you drop two things from the same height, they will reach the ground in the same time. That takes a conceptual metaphor which most members of the public can't grasp, and they can't grasp that because we don't train them to do so. And we could have so many more questions about much exciting things like the early universe if we train people to actually ask the right questions rather than using just empirical evidence and not focusing on it.
Right, there's one person slightly along. Yes, you, sir. Then I've got two in the front. I'm sorry. And then I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
Just to draw out the distinction between those questions that science is good at addressing and those where it faces some limits. Yes, if you want to know the structure of a neurotransmitter in your brain, then science is going to be the way to go. If you want to answer the question, is the Queen Elizabeth the legitimate head of state of the United Kingdom and do her subjects owe her loyalty? I think that raises a whole set of other questions, and I think it draws out that there are different questions of truth, asking questions and asserting answers is not always the same sort of activity. And today there's rather too much confusion between those different sorts of truth, I think, on all sides.
Thank you very much indeed, very helpful. Two people in the front, so can the microphones run, as it were?
In the front.
Front row. Sorry. Thank you very much. Okay, quick points in the front, and then I'll take you in the order in which you spoke for a final thought.
I think David's right about this question about what it is to be human, because for me that's a fundamental question here, that we no longer trust ourselves as ethical subjects, that we no longer treat human curiosity as a noble thing. I mean, Frank talks about ethics committees in terms of research. Forget research. In my field, terrorism studies, there's now demands for ethical approval of reading lists. We no longer trust academics to teach students to read.
Thank you very much. And this person here, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, a couple of the comments here actually just really preempted what I would like to follow up. And it was about this issue of just because something works, and the point being that, well, if science is a method, and it's a method of asking questions, and if it's true that when we find something that we think works, we then test it with applications, and I do a lot of work with engineers, and I agree with the comment just made that I think very often the application of science then becomes engineering and technology. I guess my point with that is, what's very interesting here is the point at which we stop questioning and then start creating something. And where science is a method of asking questions, it's not a method of creating a result. And any test of that result is a creation in itself. And my own field of research, just very quickly summarise, is the question of if we're looking at how people create, how they test what's real, that first they learn something, then they make applications of it. If we look at any area of research, any area of human application, and I've looked at probably about 50,000 examples myself, ranging from art, science, engineering, everything. There's a place where we start to learn the rules or test them, and then to experience them. So I guess the question in the end is...
No, don't worry about the question at the end.
The experience.
It wasn't interesting. It's just you don't have to pretend you're asking a question, you're making a point. Okay. Panel, I'm afraid you've got 60 seconds each for your final thought. Luckily, this is the opening keynote, so we've got a whole weekend to carry on this conversation. But Susan, could you give us your final thought on this particular panel?
My final thought I'll just give you from our common ancestor in reason, Thomas Paine. The only weapon against errors of every kind is reason.
Thank you very much indeed. Brilliantly timed. David?
I'd say if you've learnt anything this morning which is true, it hasn't been by the scientific method.
As I say, touche. Colin?
You asked us why right now there should be a re-emergence of the challenge to science, anti-scientific views. And I think that's because the magnitude of the problems that the Earth faces, we face, are suddenly simply enormous. And I think that in those kinds of things, when one recognizes that there are new and big challenges, you question the methodology that you have been using so far to deal with the problems which have become bigger. I would just say, science may have contributed to some of those big problems we face. It is the only route that we have towards solving them.
Thank you very much indeed. Frank?
Yeah, I think the thing that I take away from the discussion this morning is how important it is that we don't do anything that closes down discussion and discourages debate. And I think we have to be really open-minded against our opponents, whoever they are. And instead of stigmatizing their views or labeling their views as being beyond discussion and making heretics out of them, I think it's far better that we encourage a more grown-up discussion than is taking place at the moment. I think particularly those of us who are of a secular, pro-science, sort of humanist imagination, it is quite important that we are seen to be initiating discussion rather than using our privileged positions to minimize it.
Okay, thank you very much to our panel. Just a couple of points before people go. I mean, on the one hand, I'm constantly called a fundamentalist, so I think there was something in the point that was made as an atheist, and that is because of strong beliefs. But it is also the case that the number of times that I've argued political positions, for example, on assisted dying, which I disagree with, where people have said, well, that's the problem with you religious people, when actually I'm an atheist, is an indication of how these things can be used to close down debate. Can I just draw your attention to the fact that there's a ways of pursuing this discussion throughout the festival. There's a debate on abortion, the hard arguments at lunchtime. There's the battle for intelligence after lunch, which Colin is on, talking about the brain. Tomorrow we've got, is our behaviour determined by our evolution, as well as a discussion on evidence-based education. Susan is back tomorrow to talk about Election USA, and there's a whole strand of debates tomorrow on biomedicine and whether evidence and scientific evidence is being misused and abused in the name in order to pursue social policy outcomes. So there's a lot to pursue. Can we just give our panel a final thank you for a great start to the day?